Congratulations to you and your colleagues on winning the Nobel Prize in Economics. So the first question, did you expect such a possibility? And why do you think your research and conclusions published 12 years ago as a joint work have received recognition now?
Well, I thought it was possible, but but I wasn't really thinking about it, to be honest with you. So I think just thinking about things like that makes you can just make yourself miserable. So you just, like I think it's very nice, but there's many, distinguished scholars in economics, who you could have given the Nobel Prize to. So obviously I'm delighted, but I wasn't really thinking about it. Although I knew it was possible. Um, yeah, I mean, I think we've been doing a lot of research since that book came out. Um, I think there's many things to understand. I think that if you ask me to sort of talk about the world and talk about the distribution of prosperity in the world, I basically talk about it in the same way we did in the book. So in that sense, I still think it's a useful framework for thinking about the world, but there's many things to understand, such as, what is really going on in China, that would be an obvious one. But I still think about it. If you ask me to say one thing about China, I'd still say the same thing.
So you worked closely with two other scholars, Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, throughout much of your career. How did you divide the work between you? Was it a natural process, or did you have to consciously decide who would handle certain aspects of the research? Could you share with it?
I mean, I think that's, like when you've been working together with people for so long and you know them so well, kind of at a personal level, it's extremely easy to divide tasks and do different things. So I think we're all good at doing different things, but it's very easy to, when we meet and stuff and we talk about ideas or we talk about a research project, then it's very easy for us to say, okay, you have a first go at that and you do this, or why don't you look at that? Or so it's very difficult for me to kind of talk about that because it just happens in such a kind of natural way and no one's taking note. No one's taking notes, like no one's kind of counting who did what or whatever, it's just very much a joint product.
And were there areas where you disagreed or had to challenge each other's thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, we don't disagree that much actually, or if we do disagree, we kind of debate, and then we nearly always converge on a kind of common interpretation of what's happening. I think we've been discussing for years some sorts of topics and how you bring those topics into the analysis, like, ideas, for example, the role of ideas, like if you were going to talk about the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution closer to home, in Kazakhstan. If you were going to talk about the Bolshevik Revolution, it'd be hard to do that without talking about ideas, no? But it's very hard to have a kind of social science framework for thinking about the generation and impact of ideas and the role of culture. I work a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, and and I'm very interested in African culture and African history, and how do you bring culture into this framework? That's so I don't know that we disagree, but there's things we don't know how to study really.
In your research, you contrast two types of institutions, political and economic, which at the same time strengthen each other. And the question is, why did this particular topic interest you?
Well, I mean, the big topic is just the kind of inequality in the world and the differences. Why are there these huge differences between poor and rich countries? And there's lots of differences you could have looked at, but one obvious one is economic. So then, it's natural to study economic institutions as they sort of structure the economy and they influence economic incentives. And, to an extent, economists were thinking about that, when we started the work on this. But for us, it's not enough to talk about economic institutions. So for example, like if I tell you that the reason that there's a hyperinflation in Argentina is because the government is printing a lot of money, Fine. Okay. There's a theory of hyperinflation. You're printing a lot of money. So for most economists, they'd be happy to, that's it. They'd be happy to stop there. What's the solution to that? Stop printing money. That's the solution. That's it. So, but like for me, that's not enough. It's not enough. It's like, why is it that the government is kind of engaging in this self-defeating, inefficient policy? That's about politics. So when I was a student, I could never understand like why economists were happy to sort of stop at this level that I found very superficial. Behind that is obviously politics. So then, we wanted to think about the politics and, political institutions is what structures politics and the political process. So that's, I think for us, it's an obvious next step to take. Yeah.
You often give examples of influence and interaction of political institutions with existing systems of political values in different countries. In this regard, I would like to ask you about your opinion about the current elections in the United States and the role of big businessmen such as Elon Musk in supporting political candidates. Do you think that actions such as financial support for voters or the promotion of certain political values like freedom of speech and the right to bear arms can have a significant impact on democratic process? So, what role do economic elites play in shaping political realities? That's the question.
Well, I mean, I think this is an issue, that we've written about, which is the corrosive effect of economic inequality on on politics. That the enormous increase in economic inequality in the last 40 years is sort of feeding back onto politics now. In the sense that in Elon Musk is engaged, what in Latin America would be called like turnout buying, basically paying Republicans to turn out. So he's using his immense kind of wealth to push one presidential candidate. That's kind of unusual, actually, in this country. I mean, it signifies a transition that even very wealthy people who've kind of had political preferences have donated money in a much more covert, sort of quiet, anonymous way. And, but that's not his style. He's just interested in being in the news and being important. And he can't be president himself because he was born in South Africa. You have to be born a US citizen to be president. I'm sure otherwise he'd be running for president. So I think it's a disaster, honestly. I mean, he's a citizen and he has the right to his opinion and he has the right to voice his opinion. But I don't think democracy can sort of withstand this enormous influx, and in the context where institutions are, if President Trump comes to power, institutions are going to be seriously under threat. The combination of, President Trump doesn't care about institutions at all, so the combination of deinstitutionalization with this enormous influx of money and from is going to be a disaster. I think it's going to be a disaster for democracy in this country.
Do you consider Central Asia region, including Kazakhstan, as an object of the research in the future, as an object, yeah, of the
Well, yeah, I
research?
mean, it would be fascinating. I went to Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan last year to kind of launch the translations of my book, and I have a very good friend who's an economist who's from Uzbekistan. I certainly, but my research is very driven by kind of questions, so. And I follow the question. So the question could be anywhere in the world, but obviously I've worked a lot in Latin America and Africa, and and I know much more. I'm in the middle of writing a book about Africa, actually. So I would consider researching anywhere, but I have to get the right sort of question. That's how I work. Yeah.
So in your work, you also drew attention to Afghanistan, where at the time there was no centralized power and the country's economic development dependent on the balance of power between competing clans. Can we say that with the Taliban's coming to power, centralization of power occurred? And what can change now in terms of Afghanistan's economic development?
Well, I mean, I think a fascinating, in some sense, the Taliban has much more control over the country than any any previous US sponsored government has. I mean, my impression is that previous presidents, didn't rule the country at all. They had very little control over the country, and the Taliban has much deeper kind of mechanisms and social connections for doing that. I mean, I think it's a complicated question, the extent to which the Taliban state is actually a legitimate state in the eyes of many Afghans. I mean, I think from Americans, from the Western point of view, it seems to be a completely illegitimate thing. But my reading of this, superficial as it may be, is that that's actually not true. The Taliban, of course, the Taliban overrepresents part of the country, the Pashtun people, and Afghanistan is a sort of multicultural state. In the north you have Uzbeks, you have all sorts of people. So there's an issue about whether the Taliban is a government for part of the country, but not the other part of the country. But I do think, this emphasis on Islam and the kind of Islamic foundations for the state, I guess that's something that resonates with many people in Afghanistan. And, I think the United States completely failed to construct an effective or legitimate state in Afghanistan. And that wasn't helping people, So somehow you have to start again. And that's what there is, So I think what you have to do is you have to engage with the Taliban. You have to you have to engage with them on the issues that you care about, and you have to try to work with them and not turn them into a kind of international pariah, because that's the government. I mean, I don't see, like, why would the government in China be any more legitimate than the government in Afghanistan? I mean, so and we don't have any problems dealing with the government in China. It's just that the United States was humiliated in Afghanistan, so it's sort of difficult to engage with them, I think, for that reason. But I don't think I think that's how it is. I don't see the point in vilifying them. I mean, there's lots of things we disagree with, in the sense of how they treat women, and there's many other things that are kind of very inconsistent with Western values. But
You mentioned China. I would also like to touch on the topic of China's economic development. When studying the economy of today's China, you relied on several works, including Plutocrats by Chrystia Freeland. So my question would be, like, can we still say that China's economic growth rate is higher than in developed countries? If so, how do you explain this?
Well, I think China's growth rate is bound to slow down. It can't carry on at 10% a year, whatever, forever and ever. So I think the growth processes naturally tend to slow down. You do lots of easy things to start with, and then it gets harder, and then you have to innovate, and that leads to slower economic growth. So I think it's natural it's going to slow down. But obviously China is kind of dynamic economically in a way that, probably no other developing country is, and China has sort of spread in all sorts of ways. I was reading a fascinating story in the New York Times last week about the Chinese people buying up all these coffee shops in Italy, and Chinese baristas, they call them, so there's a sort of very interesting phenomenon of the spread of China in many ways, so I, can that go on? I think, that what we said in Why Nations Fail is we don't think that can go on, because there's no historical precedent for having a modern kind of inclusive, innovative economy with a totalitarian political system. I think ultimately, what the Communist Party are really interested in is staying in power and controlling people. And at some point that's going to become very inconsistent with economic growth. So I still think that's still my prediction about China, to be honest with you. Yeah.
Mr. Robinson, what global economic processes taking place now have interested you as a scientist? What are you working on now? Can we know what can we expect next?
Well, I think, different things. I mean, as I said, I'm writing this book on Africa, which is mostly finished, but I don't know how generally interesting that is. I think Professor Asa, I have many small projects in Africa and also in Latin America, kind of specific research questions. But on the bigger issues, I think Professor Acemoglu and I, as I said earlier, we're very interested in this role of ideas. Sort of, I think if you look at kind of world history, then, like the way I always talk about these institutions is, this really about how humans themselves kind of create different societies. We emphasize very much how collectively societies sort of create these rules, these institutions that they live under. But I think ideas are very important in that process, and what you might say broadly as sort of culture. I think if you looked historically, for example, the role of religious ideas are very important in bringing communities together, and so I think that's what we're thinking about a lot. Yeah.
So what has been a major influence on your thinking as you progress through your career? I would like to ask, please.
Major influence, you mean a person
Yeah, yeah.
or?
I think it would be great if you would say a person, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think different, different people. I think I've been very lucky, in the sense that, many people have kind of helped me and pushed me. I think, I was saying at the conference in Chicago on Monday, my thesis advisor, when I was a PhD student at Yale, he was very important in kind of shaping the way I think about the world. And one person I didn't mention there, is Kenneth Sokolov, who was he's passed away now, but he was an economic historian at UCLA. And my first job in the United States was in Los Angeles, teaching at the University of Southern California. And I got very friendly with Ken, and he did sort of fundamental research on kind of the comparative economic development of the Americas, in particular, why North America diverged from Latin America. And that work was extremely important for us. In some sense, he was like an economic historian. He didn't test hypotheses or run regressions, but his work was very important in kind of providing the framework that led, kind of helping us get a framework that led to that early work for which we got the Nobel Prize. So I think Ken's work and his co-author Stanley Engerman, both of whom were very good friends of mine, and uh, yeah, I mean, there's many people who kind of inspired me. I mean, one of my, the last person I would mention is there's a great historian of Africa called Jan van Sina, who's also passed away now, whose work I found extremely, like, he just laid out this agenda for kind of thinking about the deep history of Africa, um, which was amazing to me. It was kind of mind-blowing when I started reading his books, and I got to know him a little bit before he died, and he was also very inspiring, like an amazing scholar. Yeah.
So I know that it's been like less a month, but I'd like to ask you how was uh winning a Nobel Prize? How has this recognition impacted your daily life or approach to work? Have there been any unexpected changes, maybe on your opportunities since this
I haven't
announcement?
Yeah, I haven't had any time to work since I got the since the announcement came. I've just been doing hundreds of things like this and talking to people and doing interviews and answering emails. You think I got 5,000 emails last week. So I've been I don't know the answer to that, honestly. Like it's too early to tell. I'm just, I'm still in this kind of, there's still like a lot of chaos, and so you'd have to ask me in a few months, I think.
What do you see as your next big challenge or goal, life goal, maybe?
I mean, one of the things I've been trying to do, the last few years is I teach a lot in Africa, and I'm trying to collaborate with many young scholars, African scholars and, Western scholars, but just try to kind of improve the quality of social science education in Africa. I think, there are initiatives, but they're not intellectually ambitious enough. And, what I would love to see is more African scholars and more African intellectuals kind of taking part in discussions about the continent, in the set, you go to a conference about Africa and it's just a bunch of white people, uh, and we need more Africans. We need more African scholars. We need, like, so that's something I've been investing a lot of time and effort into, and I hope to make. I would really like to make some progress on that. Yes.
Your work touches on the intersection of economics, politics, and history. What books have been most influential in shaping of your thinking? Are there any recent works, be it either academic or non-academic, that you would like to recommend to readers to to better understand the world dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about many books. I think, one of the books that was very important for me when I was a student was a book by Robert Bates called Markets and States in Tropical Africa, which was a sort of political explanation for economic decline in post-colonial Africa. And I think that was very influential. It's not how I'd think about it now at all, but it was very influential for me that it kind of he was a political scientist, but but it brought together economics and politics in this way that was very, very exciting for me. I think, Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, is very inspiring as a sort of kind of trying to tackle these big questions about comparative development in history, which is something we're very fascinated by. I think Ian Morris's book, Why the West Rules for Now, which is sort of about the relationship between China and the West, is also, again, I don't really agree with his thesis, but it's a very fascinating and exciting, and that's an accessible book. I don't know. There's many books. There's a beautiful book by two archaeologists, Joyce Marcus and Kent Flannery, called On the Origins of Inequality, which is sort of, again, looking. I tend to like these very historical things. It's a book that looks at the origins of inequality in human society and when inequality emerged, and going back 10,000 years, and so. Yeah, I don't know how accessible these books are but certainly Guns, Germs, and Steel is very accessible and exciting. I completely disagree with the thesis. I don't think the fate of human society is really determined by geography and things like that. I think it's really determined by how humans themselves build their society, and I don't think that's particularly constrained actually by I don't think the success or failure is determined by the sort of factors he focuses, but it's just a brilliantly written book, and it just makes you think.
Thank you for that many book recommendations. And what are your favorite books outside of economics and politics? For example, do you have any favorite novels that you'd like to recommend?
Yeah, I mean, when I teach, I think novels are very powerful. I mean, I tend to be obsessed with social science, so but I think novels are a very powerful way of thinking about, sometimes, like, I tell people when I teach a class on Africa, I tell people that, if you want to understand African society, that's actually better depicted in novels than it is in academic books. So, for example, Things Fall Apart. I don't know if you ever heard of a novel called Things Fall Apart by Chinua
Yes.
Achebe. Yeah, so that's an amazing book about kind of pre-colonial society in Eastern Nigeria. That's a beautiful book. If you want to learn about Colombia, you probably should start by reading 100 Years of Solitude, for example, by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Um, so I like sort of literature, but literature which is about, politics and society. I just read, for example, Vargas Llosa's most recent novel, Harsh Times, which is about the coup in 1954 in Guatemala, basically precipitated by the United Fruit Company against the government, which was trying to push for land reform. So I read a lot of novels about Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world, but I tend to like novels that are about society and social problems and about history and things like that. Yeah.
I would also like to ask you, is there anything that you would like to add? Maybe something that we haven't covered yet, maybe something that you would like to say to our readers.
No, I think that's good.
Okay. Thank you so much for this great discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.
Thank you.